The impossible dwelling, building heaven in the deserty. The impossible command. Most people imagine the tabernacle as a simple tent in the desert, a rustic shelter made of poles and cloth to keep the sun off a religious relic. But what was built there was not simple. It was impossible. Picture the setting. The Sinai Peninsula, a wasteland of scorching sand, jagged rocks, and unrelenting sun. There was no infrastructure, no running water, no steady fuel supply, and certainly no industrial technology. Yet, in the middle of this hostile nothingness, God gave a command that defied the reality of the environment. Build me a sanctuary. This was not a suggestion to stack stones. The specifications were terrifyingly precise. Gold H had to be melted at over 1,000 degrees Celsius and refined to purity. Measurements had to be exact to the millimeter. Materials had to be sourced that simply did not exist in the dunes. Nothing could fail. The material was precious. The work was dangerous. And the workforce was, frankly, unqualified. When God brought Moses up the mountain, he didn't just hand him a blooper or a shopping list. He showed him a celestial pattern. Moses saw, with his own eyes, a reality that existed in the heavens, a design of perfect proportion and holy beauty. The command was to replicate this heavenly reality on earth, without improvisation, without shortcuts, and without error. Because this place would not just be a tent, it would be the dwelling place of the seer, eater of the universe. But as Moses descended the mountain with this vision burning in his mind, he looked out over the camp and saw his workforce. The people waiting at the foot of Sinai were renowned artisans or master architects. They were broken people. For generations, they had lived under the crushing weight of Egyptian servitude. Their hands were callous from making mud, bricks mixed with straw. They knew the whip, the clay pit, and the heavy lift. They did not know how to work gold filigree, how to cast silver sockets, or how to weave complex tapestries. With royal dyes, how could a nation of bricklayers build a palace for God? 2. The spirit of the craftsman's answer began with a name. Scripture tells us that God called Bezalel by name. Out of hundreds of thousands of men, he appointed a single individual. But appointment wasn't enough. Ability was required. So God did something extraordinary. He filled Bezalel with his spirit. We often are so. C8, the filling of the spirit with prophecy or preaching. But here, the Spirit brought a different kind of power, wisdom, understanding, and knowledge in all craftsmanship. Suddenly, Bezalel, his hands possessed a divine dexterity. He could see a raw nugget of gold and understand exactly how to shape it into a cherub's wing. But the desert demanded unity. One man, no matter how gifted, could not build the tabernacle alone. So God chose Oholiab to stand beside him, and to these 2 men, he gave a gift that was just as precious as their skill, the ability to tiak. It was a transformation of identity. Men who were tired, broken by the hard labor of Egypt, gathered round these masters. They began to learn. Hands that had only ever known the crude shaping of mud began to learn the delicate art of carving acacia wood. Fingers that had dragged heavy stones learned to spin fine linen. They were learning to shape metals, mix paints, and engineer structures. Slow. Why, the precision of the artisan replaced the brute force of the slave. They were no longer just survivors. They were builders of a living sanctuary. This transformation revealed a profound truth. Even in the most unlikely environment, God prepares ordinary men for works that surpass human limits. 3. The furnace in the sand to build the tabernacle. God commanded that many elements be made of pure gold. The ark, the table, the altar of incense, and the great menorah. But there is a detail of physics we rarely consider. Gold only becomes liquid at 1064 C, How? How could a nomadic people in the middle of a desert, without coal mines, without industrial furnaces, without electricity, generate and sustain that kind of heat? The answer has roots that go back sea. In Tories, during their 400 years in Egypt, the Hebrews did more than make bricks. They were observers. Egypt was the technological superpower of the ancient world. Even as slaves, the Hebrews lived in the shadow of advanced metallurgy, pottery, and construction. They had seen the fires of the Pharaoh's foundries. They knew the theory. But theory doesn't melt gold. Fuel dough. And the desert had no oak or hardwood forests. It had no coal. It was then that the solution rose from the only abundant resource in Sinai, the acacia tree. To the naked eye, the acacia is a miserable tree, twisted, gnarled, full of thorns, and seemingly useless for lumber. But it hid a secret. When transformed into charcoal, the dense wood of the acacia burns with a slow, constant, and intensely hot flame, much hotter than ordinary firewood. The people built clay ovens directly into the sand. To feed these ovens, they crafted leather bellows to inject a continuous stream of oxygen into the heart of the fire. The work was merciless. Imagine the scene. It is 40 degrees Celsius under the relentless desert sun. The ground burns your feet. The dry air scorches your lungs. And just a few steps away, furnaces are spewing flames of over 1,000 degrees. It was impossible to stay near the fire for long. Men took turns working the bellows, keeping the air flowing, at pouring off their bodies, evaporating almost instantly in the superheated air. They had to hold their tools with thick cloths to keep their skin from blistering. Splashes of molten metal were constant, deadly risk. Yet the work could not stop. To mold the sacred objects, the fire had to remain constant for hours, for the hammer and the menorah hammer on all the golden objects. Air was one that made even the bravest craftsman hot. Heavy, the golden candelabrum, the menorah. The divine order was strict. It was not to be cast in parts and soldered together. It was not to be built round a wooden core. It had to be made from a single talent of pure gold, approximately 35 kilograms. It had to be hammered out of one solid lump until it became a perfect candelabrum with a central shaft, 6 branches, almond blossoms and cups. This required a terrifying level of skill. One mistake in calculating the temperature, and the gold would crack. One ill-gotten blow of the hammer, and a branch would be too thin. One error, and the entire 35 kilograms piece would have to be melted down to start from scratch. There, before that impossible fire, former slaves were forged along with the gold. The metal was transformed by the heat. The men were transformed by obedience. The work was arduous, dangerous, and exhausting. But with every strike of the hammer, a thought echo through the camp. We are building the house of the God who freed you. The skeleton of a culture while the gold was taking shape in the fire. Another team worked at a different pace, silent, patient, brutal. They were building the skeleton of the Tabernacle. God asked for the structure to be made of acacia wood. To any Hebrew, this seemed strange. Acacia was stubborn wood, crooked, not tie, and difficult to work. It resisted the saw and dulled the blade. But God didn't want ordinary wood. He needed wood that wouldn't rot. He needed wood that insects couldn't eat. He needed wood as hard as stone that could withstand the thermal shock of the desert day and night. He needed wood that could survive in the wilderness, just as his people would have to survive. The process was physically devastating. Each plank needed to be huge, approximately 4.5 meters high and 70 centimeters wide. The trees were crooked, so the artisans had to cut, plane, and scrape the irregular logs until they were perfectly straight boards. There was no room for improvisation. The measurements were divine law. Former slaves wielded primitive saws and planes, tearing thick splinters from the hard wood with their calloused hands. Each plank took days to perfect, and when one was finished, they couldn't rest. They needed 48 identical planks stopped. Then came the alchemy. These perfected boards were completely overlaid with gold. The crooked, thorny wood was hidden inside a casing of glory. The common was transformed into the sacred, that which looked useless at first. Lands became the very standing structure of gods. House.vi, engineering the mobile temple here. The project faced its greatest engineering challenge. The tabernacle was not a fixed temple. It had no stone foundation. It could not be cemented into the ground. Why? Because the God of Israel moved. When the pillar of cloud lifted, everything tons of gold, silver, bronze, and wood had to be dismantled in hours and carried away. This created a dilemma. How do you keep 48 gigantic, gold-plated wooden boards upright on unstable sand? If you placed them on the ground, they would sink. A gust of wind would topple them like dominoes. The solution God gave Moses defied the engineering of the time. It was a prefabricated modular system. The answer was silver. God commanded that each acacia plank have 10 or feet at the bottom. These feet fit perfectly into two solid silver bases sockets. These weren't small stands. Each base weighed a talent, about 35 kilograms. Yes, imagine the scene. Heavy silver blocks laid out in precise lines across the desert floor. They acted as movable footings. They were heavy enough to provide a low center of gravity, anchoring the walls against the wind. They distributed the weight of the planks so they wouldn't sink into the sand. There were no nails, no screws, no permanent fixtures. Everything worked through weight, gravity, and precise fit. But weight alone wasn't enough to hold up for 0.5-meter walls. So God ordained crossbars, long beams of acacia overlaid with gold. These bars slid through gold rings attached to the plough, locking the walls together laterally. It transformed 48 individual boards into a single, rigid, box-like structure. Most impressively, this system had to withstand the wear and tear of 40 years. Assemble, disassemble, load onto wagons, march, stop, reassemble. For decades, the joints never wore out. The stability never failed. Why? Because the measurements were not human estimates. They were divine coordinates executed by spirit-filled men. Weaving the colors of heavenly structure stood. The golden skeleton waited. But God didn't just want walls. He wanted beauty. He wanted the interior to resemble the heaven Moses saw on the mountain. This brings us to the fabrics. God asked for fine linen, artistically woven with blue, purple, and crimson. It sounded impossible. Where does one get blue and purple? Dye in a desert, in the ancient world. These colors were royal luxuries. Purple dye was extracted from the glands of the murex sea snail. It too took thousands of snails to produce just a few grams of dye. It was worth more than gold. And here were the Hebrews, stranded in Sinai, far from the Mediterranean coast, far from the trade routes of Phoenicia. Where did the material come from? The answer lies in the Exodus itself. On the night of the Passover, the Egyptians, terrified by the final plague, begged the Hebrews to leave. He handed over their wealth, gold, silver, and fine fabrics just to get them out. The materials were spoils of war, given by the hand of God before the battle even began. But heaven, the material was one thing. Weaving it was another. The Bible speaks of all the skilled women of heart. These women took the raw fibers, they spun, they dyed the threads, repeating the process over and over under the sun until the colors were rich. And deep. The instruction for the inner curtains was specific, with cherubim of artistic work. This didn't mean sewing a picture of an angel onto a finished cloth. The text implies a complex tapestry weave, where the figure of the cherub is created by the structure of the thread itself as it is woven on the loom. This required advanced mathematics before a single thread was placed. The women had to calculate the entire design. They had to know exactly where the blue thread stopped and the crimson thread began. One miscount in tea, he warp or weft, and the cherub's face would be distorted. They were creating royal tapestries inside makeshift tents. Without graph paper or computers. The result was breathtaking from the outside. The tabernacle looked like a Bedouin, tent rough badger skins and goat hair, beaten by the sun. But step inside, and you were transported. Overhead, winged cherubim looked down from a ceiling of blue, purple, and red. The vibrant colors reflected the golden light of the menorah. It was a visual theology. The sacred is hidden beneath the simple. The eternal is wrapped in the common. 8. The garments of survival while the tent was being raised. The artisans finished the final component, the uniform of the high priest. These were not just ceremonial robes, they were survivalic. Movement, entering the most holy place, was a risk. It was an encounter with the raw and filled holiness of God. One mistake, one irreverence, and the priest could die. The garments described in Exodus 28 were designed for spiritual protection. Consider the ephod and the breastplate. The breastplate of judgment was a masterpiece of lapidary work. It contained 12 precious stones, one for each tribe. These stones had to be cut, polished, and engraved with the names of the tribes. In antiquity, engraving a gem like a diamond or emerald required abrasive powders and hand drills. It was slow, surgical work. The priest carried these stones over his heart. They were fastened with chains of pure gold. The physical weight was heavy, but the spiritual weight was crushing. He carried the names of the millions of Israel into the presence of God. Then there was the robe of the ephod, made entirely of blue. On its hem hung a strange combination, a pomegranate made of fur, brick, then a bell of gold. Pomegranate, bell, pomegranate, bell. Exodus 28-35 gives the chilling reason. The sound of the bells will be heard when he enters the sanctuary, so that he does not die. The bells were a life monitor. As long as the people outside heard the tinkling ding, 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 they knew the high priest was moving. He was alive. Their holiness had not consumed him. Silence was the sound of death. Tradition says they even tied a rope round his waist, so if the bells stopped and he died inside, they could drag his body out without entering themselves on his forehead. He wore a plate of pure gold engraved with holiness to the Lord. It was his passport. It declared that he did not enter by his own merit, but under the covering of God's holiness, the assembly and the glory. Finally, the day came. Exodus 40 dates it precisely. The first day of the first month of the second year, almost a year after leaving Egypt. The command came, raise the tabernacle. The assembly began. It was a choreographed act of worship. The men laid the heavy silver sockets in the dust, aligning them perfectly. They lifted the gold-plated acacia boards, fitting the tenons into the silver. A wall of gold rose from the sand. They slid the crossbars through the golden rings, locking the structure. They draped the heavy linens with a cherubim, then the goat hair, then the redskins. Then the badger skins, they brought in the furniture. The Ark of the Covenant glided into the most holy place. The veil was hung, sealing off the room, the table, the menorah, and the altar. Incense took their places. Outside, the bronze altar and the laver were set. Everything was in place. The gold shone. The oil lamps flickered. The incense began to smoke. The house was ready, but it was empty. The question hung in the air. Would God accept it? The people stood at the entrances of their tents, watching in silence. The wind died down. Moses stepped out. Then it happened. A cloud dense, heavy, and terrifying descended from heaven. It covered the tent of meeting. It didn't just hover. It permeated. The text says the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle so completely that not even Moses could enter. The man who had spoken to God face to face, who had walked into the fire of Sinai, could not step though. Inside. The weight of God's presence, the Shekinah, was physically impenetrable. The tabernacle was no longer a human project. It was an inhabited house. The journey and the shadow from that day. Aeon, the rhythm of the nation changed. When the cloud lifted from the tent, Israel struck camp and marched. When the cloud settled, they stopped and set up the tabernacle for 40 years. Through the wandering, the divine presence was visible. It was their GPS, their protection, and their center. But the story doesn't end in the desert. The tabernacle was never the final plan. It was temporary. It was mobile. It was a shadow of things to come. Decades later, when Israel entered the Promised Land, the tent settled in Shiloh. But as Israel built houses of stone and cedar, the contrast became painful. King David lamented, "I dwell in a house of cedar, but the ark of God dwells inside tent curtains." He wanted to build a temple, a permanent house. God said no, but promised that his son, Solomon, would build it. The tabernacle was the prototype. Every plank, every curtain, every ritual was a physical lesson teaching a spiritual reality. It showed that God rested well with man, but that the way is precise, costly, and requires a mediator. The mobile tent of the desert became the blueprint for the Temple of Solomon, the most impressive construction of antiquity. But even that temple was not the end. It all pointed forward to a greater reality, a time when God would not dwell in houses made by human hands, but within the human here itself. But how did a tent in the desert evolve into the gold-laden stone temple of Jerusalem? That is a story for another time.